I'm Leslie Kirk, Chair of the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, here to introduce Victoria Wohl for her one-off Sather Lecture, which will kick off our series of 4 returning Sather professors giving lectures this spring. But first, let me pause to explain why we have this unusual structure this year. Now, it happens that the scholars we invite to be Sather professors, usually 4 to 5 years in advance, we invite them, are not just highly distinguished, but also busy people with complicated lives. And so occasionally someone needs to put off their visit for a year for the sake of a child finishing high school or a fixed retirement date, for example. So in that case, it can happen that we have a gap year in our sequence. This year was such a year, and following the precedent set by Nellie Oliensis when she was chair during the pandemic of arranging 4 one-off lectures by former Sather professors, then of course entirely on Zoom, we've arranged another such set. But this is not merely a practical expedient. There is a real value in pausing and taking stock, and having a retrospective moment where we think about the life cycle and the impact of Sather professors. To the wider world, the most obvious impact of the Sather professor and the Sather lectures comes with the publication of the Sather book, which in many cases represents a field-changing intervention by a senior scholar at the height of their career. But for those of us here in Berkeley, there's also the more intangible, experiential impact of the Sather professor, their lectures, but also their graduate seminar, and the multiple informal conversations and interactions enabled by their residence in our community for a whole semester. This personal performative impact of the Sather professor's presence ripples out in Berkeley through time, felt in the projects graduate students develop and the way they talk about them, in the writing and the teaching of our faculty, in the friendships and connections we establish and maintain. All of this, which springs from the regular presence in our community of distinguished visitors, enriches the intellectual life of our department immeasurably. And in relation to this dimension, it's a particular treat to have former Sather professors of different vintages come back, offer us their new or additional thoughts in lectures, reconnect with students and faculty, and remind us that through the Sather professorship, the networks of our community extend far beyond this place, radiating out across a connected world. So it is with great pleasure that we are able to welcome back 4 Sather professors, beginning with Victoria Wohl, who was in fact the most recent visitor of the 4. Victoria Wohl is Distinguished Professor of Classics at the University of Toronto, where she has taught since 2006. She is a prolific scholar with 4 books thus far, 1 edited volume, and dozens of articles and book chapters to her credit. She is also the winner of many fellowships, awards, and giver of prestigious named lectures, culminating, of course, in the Sather Lecture she delivered at Berkeley in fall 2023, entitled The Poetry of Being and the Prose of the World in Early Greek Philosophy. The book, based on those lectures, completed, I would say, in record time, is already in production and will appear in September 2025. With the same title, here is a mock-up of her cover. She already has a cover. It was fantastic. Now, I want to flesh out those bare facts of Victoria's CV by talking about some of the things that make her work distinctive. Number 1, not just the amount of excellent scholarship she has produced, which is impressive by any measure, but her remarkable range. In a field where many distinguished scholars devote their entire careers to a single genre or author or even a single text, Victoria has produced paradigm-shifting work on Greek tragedy, but also on Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, Greek law and forensic oratory, political theory, and now in her Sather book on the pre-Socratics. What goes along with this, number 2, the sheer fearlessness of Victoria's work. She has tackled the most difficult authors, Aeschylus, Thucydides, Heraclitus, the most complex issues, time, agency, subjectivity, metaphysics, with different innovative approaches, often at a skew line to traditions of scholarship, so guaranteed to ruffle feathers and raise hackles. So, for example, her tour de force psychoanalytic reading of the troubled democratic unconscious of Pericles' funeral oration in Love Among the Ruins, her second book, or the bold deconstruction she offered of the unity of being in Parmenides and Heraclitus in her Sather lectures of fall 2023. Number 3, the seriousness and rigor of Victoria's thinking and writing. Victoria combines theoretical rigor with rigorous attention to the text, its language and form, as well as rigorous historicizing. I'm thinking here, for example, of her brilliant argument, drawing on Raymond Williams, that Euripides' Orestes articulates the structures of feeling of Athens between two moments of stasis. All these different kinds of rigor together make Victoria's arguments truly dialectical, often using the exacting reading of text to critique and nuance the theories. So, for example, the way she leverages the apocalyptic posthumanism of Euripides' Trojan women to critique the chirpy new materialism of Jane Bennett in her essay In the Materialities of Greek Tragedy. Another thing I really admire about Victoria, this is my number 4, across her remarkable range, the consistency of her issues and preoccupations. Here I would mention problems of language/signification and the misfit between word and world. So in her Sather lecture series of 2023, How Language Unravels Being. Again, psychoanalysis is a central preoccupation, specifically the subversion or undoing of the subject, as in her argument about Heraclitus, showing us in anti-Snellian terms the self as the gap or interval that breaks the perfect circle of being. Third, politics, Victoria's attunement to an unmasking of power hierarchies and power inequalities, often from the perspective of those who are abjected or oppressed. This I take to be a subversive feminist agenda in Victoria's work. Manifested, for example, in the critical politics of her Sather lectures on Empedocles and Anaxagoras. Finally, and this observation comes especially from Victoria's residence with us in fall 2023, where I had a chance to witness it in close quarters. This is my number 5. Victoria has an apparently endless capacity to generate new, rich ideas about texts of all kinds, and is one of the most hardworking academics I have ever known. When she was here in fall 2023, we took a ruthless advantage of her, calling on her to contribute to several more conferences and workshops beyond the 6 beautifully crafted Sather lectures she was already delivering. And Victoria never faltered or stuttered. She was always there, fully engaged with a brilliant, wholly original, exquisite paper, response, or question. And so we have continued to impose on Victoria, and she's graciously agreed to give us yet another Sather lecture, this one her 7th. So please join me in welcoming Victoria Wohl for her Sather lecture, Intelligent Air.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everybody, for being here on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. It's so lovely to be back in Berkeley and to see so many friendly faces. Okay, intelligent air. Air is the most metaphysical of the 4 elements. In contrast to the resolutely earthbound earth, air rises towards the immaterial, even the spiritual. Air is matter. It's composed of chemicals, nitrogen, oxygen, a bit of argon and carbon dioxide, and it has its own physical properties. But it becomes visible only when mixed with other elements, as mist, cloud, smoke, or pollution. And its usual transparency makes it a strangely insubstantial substance, something with the qualities of nothing. Air seems to oscillate between matter and the immaterial. It seemed so already to the ancient Greeks. For Homer, the word aer denotes a mist substantial enough to conceal things from view, but also the quality of invisibility that results. Is the air that makes things invisible itself visible or invisible? Air is the space of appearance or non-appearance of phenomena, the phainasthai that makes them phenomena, but itself is only ambiguously phenomenal. Aristotle treats air as the paradigmatic medium of perception, a transparent metaxu, or in-between, through which sensory objects act on our sense organs. But air is not itself neutral, not a mere void. If it were, he says, we would be able to see an ant in the heavens. That we cannot means that air is not nothing, even if it is not entirely something. In fact, the very qualities that make air an ideal medium also make it a problematic one. At once a familiar earthly phenomenon and a vehicle of the divine, perhaps even divine itself, air circulates between the physical and the metaphysical, overflowing that key division. All-pervasive, it mediates between the particular and universal, connecting the individual and the cosmos with every breath. This mediation, as we shall see, is what makes of our cosmos a cosmos in the original Greek sense of the word, not just a world, but an intelligible, even beautiful world order. And yet, air as medium is always at risk of evaporating, either evanescing into metaphysical speculation or else dissolving into mere matter, just so much nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Drawn to one or the other side of the polarities it mediates, air has a tendency to double and divide. Already in Homer, misty atmospheric air is doubled by aether, the resplendent upper air where the gods reside. Aristotle develops this duality. He theorizes aether as a fifth element, akin to air and fire, but infinitely purer than either. Unchanging and perfect, this sublime quintessence governs the rotation of the celestial spheres. Aristotle also gives air a sublunary twin, pneuma, the bodily heat that enables life and growth. He calls this heat breath, that's what pneuma means, but distinguishes it emphatically from breath, since it belongs to all living beings, even those, like plants, that were thought not to breathe. Pneuma and aether both are and are not air. They draw on air's medial role, but supplement it on either side. More physical and corporeal in the case of pneuma, more metaphysical and even theological in the case of aether. But even that distinction fails to hold. In a famous passage of On Generation of Animals, Aristotle compares the pneuma contained within semen to the astral element, that is, aether. Air's qualities split only to recombine, its mediation always mobile and mutating. What would it mean to take this unstable element as the foundation for philosophy? This is the question posed by Luce Irigaray in The Forgetting of Air in Martin Heidegger. Against the philosophical tradition that privileges Earth as the ground of understanding, terrestrial metaphors both, Irigaray recuperates air as the unacknowledged element of both thought and being. Flowing between the sensible and intelligible, the immanent and transcendent, air sustains, even as it eludes, those distinctions so central to Western philosophy. It is, as she says, the groundless foundation of metaphysics. Air is the medium of presence, but only by lacking presence in itself. Likewise, it enables thought, but itself remains unthinkable. Irigaray writes, air does not show itself. As such, it escapes appearing as a being. It allows itself to be forgotten. Air remains the unthought resource of being. Unthinkable? The Greek natural philosophers of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE had not yet forgotten air, and they thought hard about this unthinkable element and its ambiguous materiality. Robert Renehan proposes that air was instrumental in the development of a concept of immateriality in this period. Before they had a technical vocabulary of incorporeality, air let the Greeks conceptualize the immaterial and separate it from matter, a process that culminates in Plato's ontology of the forms. But idealism of the Platonic ilk was in fact an anomaly in ancient Greek thought, which, as Jim Porter has shown, was resolutely materialist. We should think of air, then, not as the vehicle of spirit's liberation from crude matter, but as the medium in which the two meet and the complexities of their relation become manifest to thought. This is nowhere more true than in the natural philosopher Diogenes of Apollonia, who is the focus of my talk today. Diogenes was a contemporary of Socrates. Almost nothing is known of his life, not even which of the many cities named Apollonia he was from, and only a tiny bit of his work remains. What you have on the handout is nearly all there is. Diogenes built a cosmogony out of thin air. Air is his material and conceptual starting point, the origin of both his physics and his metaphysics. For him, air is intelligent, even divine. He's probably the model for the airy-fairy philosopher mocked in Aristophanes' Clouds for deposing Zeus and replacing him with atmospheric phenomena. But his air, as that caricature intuits, is also fully material, susceptible to physical processes of heating and cooling, expansion and contraction. This double character makes air both useful and problematic as a medium, and even more so as a ground of his metaphysics. Air helps Diogenes to negotiate key conceptual antitheses, not only material and immaterial, but also same and different, particular and universal, individual and world. But air's mediation is precarious. On the one hand, air connects the two terms of these antitheses, but also preserves a space between them, a nebulous metaxu that leaves the relationships it constructs vague and underdetermined. On the other hand, air always risks dissolving into one side of the equation, not so much into pure abstraction, as Irigaray claims it does for Heidegger, but into base matter, mere wind and breath. As a result, air as medium itself requires constant mediation and remediation. Diogenes will supply this in the form of intelligence, first air's intelligence and then his own. Air can function as medium only thanks to the addition of a conceptual supplement, noesis, thinking. With that supplement, air will rule and steer everything, producing a physical and metaphysical order that is both fine and beautiful, the best of all possible worlds. But intelligent air will prove liable to the same doubling as plain old air, and the same tendency, despite its sublime abstraction, to evaporate into the physical environment. More mediation is required, and more intelligence. This time it comes in the form of Diogenes' own logos, his philosophical discourse. If, as Irigaray proposes, air is the unthought material basis of logos, in Diogenes the reverse will also prove true. Logos is the unspoken discursive basis of air and the ultimate medium of his cosmology and cosmogony. So let's start at the beginning. Greek natural philosophy begins with the search for an arche, the primordial principle of the cosmos and starting point for the evolution of the world as we know it. The arche marks without resolving the conundrum of origins. How do you get something where before there was nothing? For the early Greek philosophers, this is fundamentally a problem of mediation. Since they held that being cannot be generated from non-being, the arche must mediate between a barred nothing and the something that ultimately gives rise to everything. As something with the qualities of nothing, air is a good candidate for this role. The first thinker to designate air the arche was Anaximenes, writing in the late 6th century BCE. He's quoted as saying, "Air is that from which comes to be what is, what has been, and what will be, and gods and divine things." In its pure state, the form of air is invisible, but it becomes visible by means of cold, heat, motion, and moisture. These latter don't seem to be inherent properties of air, but rather extrinsic forces to which it is susceptible. Transformed by them, it in turn engenders cosmogonic transformation. Expanding and becoming more rarefied, it becomes fire. Condensed, it becomes wind, clouds, water, and eventually earth and stone. In Anaximenes' account, that generative capacity derives from air's mediality. What's important about it is not any particular physical qualities of its own, but instead its capacity to serve as the invisible medium for transformative forces that eventually produce all the phenomena in the world, and beyond it, gods and divine things. Already we can see air's tendency towards the transcendent, an ontotheological impulse to which we will return. Diogenes follows Anaximenes in making air the starting point, both of his physical theory and of his account of it. His treatise on nature began with a self-conscious reflection on the problem of beginning, and this is the first passage on your handout. It seems to me that when one is beginning any account, one should provide a starting point that is indisputable and an explanation that is simple and solemn. This apparently simple and solemn statement is complicated by the circular relation between the starting point, arche, and the act of starting, archomenon. In the course of starting, one posits the starting point that enables one to make a start. Thus, one must already have started before one can start. The origin is always impure, bearing the trace of its own later effects. These effects include not only the cosmos, but also the logos about it. Any or every account, logu pantos, in practice here means this account, Diogenes' own logos, a fact underscored by doke moi, it seems to me. Logos is thus on the scene from the very start. The philosopher equates this logos with its cosmic contents in the coordination of archein and hermeneion. The origin is closely bound to its own explanation, interpretation, or expression, hermeneia. The two should unfold together, the origin as simple and solemn as the explication, the latter as indisputable as the former. That indisputable arche, the ancient commentators tell us, is air. Fragment B2, passage 2 on the handout, came soon after B1. To speak of the whole, it seems to me that all the things that are differentiated out of the same and are the same. And this is very clear. For if the things that are now in this cosmos, earth and water and air and fire and the other things, however many are manifest as existing in this cosmos, if any one of them were different from another, being different in its individual nature, and being the same, it did not change in many ways and become differentiated, then they would in no way be able to mix with one another, nor would any benefit or harm come about from one to the other, nor could a plant grow from the earth, nor an animal, nor anything else come into being if they were not thus composed so as to be the same. But all these things come to be through being differentiated from the same, sometimes one sort of thing, sometimes another, and they return to the same. The students from the seminar are having flashbacks to having to read that in Greek. One might complain that Diogenes is violating his opening commandment that the explanation be simple and solemn, but the gist is clear enough. Diogenes is struggling to lay a theoretical foundation for cosmogony by positing a connection between beings and being. He is attempting to account for the impermanent existence of individual phenomena, all the discrete identifiable things that are manifest as existing, phainasthai eonta, in our world. But he also posits a singular, permanent, and unchanging essence that unites them, and without which they could not interact and transform one another. That supraphenomenal essence is here named simply the same, to auto, but Simplicius, who quotes the passage, informs us that it is air. Devoid of any qualities but its own self-sameness, air enables the differentiation that for Diogenes is the engine of cosmogony. Itself invisible, it is the grounds of appearance of phenomena in their individuality. This arche air is not manifestly itself one of all the things that are. It's argued for logically, not posited empirically, but it enables their existence by providing the hazy but permanent substrate, not only of these specific things, but of all possible things. Air is, to paraphrase Erigere, the groundless foundation of Diogenes' metaphysics. This metaphysics remains ambiguously rooted in matter, though, for if air is the abstract principle of being in general, it is also apparently one of the individual beings generated from it, quote, the things that are now in this cosmos, earth and water and air and fire, and the other things, however many are manifest as existing in this cosmos. This is rather embarrassing. Air is the arche, but it would also seem to be its own derivative, a member of the set it defines, at once cause and effect. It is eternally the same, but also the difference from it, changed and changeable. What are we to make of this doubleness? Maybe we should say, with Renehan, that Diogenes hadn't yet managed to free his thought from matter and arrive, as Plato would, at the pure ideality of form. But Diogenes seems positively committed to the ambivalence, as we see in B7, passage 3. And this itself is an eternal and undying body, soma, and, or but, de, by means of it, some things come to be and others cease to be. On the one hand, air is a soma, not just material, but corporeal. On the other hand, it has qualities most bodies lack by definition. Singular and self-same, in contrast to their plurality and difference, it is eternal and undying, not subject to the generation and corruption that characterize phenomenal beings in Greek thought. The peculiarity is amplified by its underdetermined relation to these ephemeral beings. The connective de can mark either continuity or contrast. As a body, it would seem to be among the things that come to be and pass away. But if it were, how could it also be their eternal and undying origin? How can air be both immaterial cause and material effect, both a phenomenon and the underlying condition of all phenomenology? This question is not merely theoretical. If air as metaphysical arche is in fact simply air as everyday phenomenon, we lose the link between same and different and between universal and particular that in fragment B2 generates and sustains the cosmos. The conditional structure of that fragment traces the consequences. We start with our familiar world, this cosmos of earth, water, air, fire, and all the things composed from them. That world is then shattered into absolute difference. Everything is other to every other thing, a fragmentation reproduced textually in the different forms of heteron, different. Each locked in its own private phusis, the elements cannot interact in the way necessary for generation. The results are imagined in a string of negations, nor could a plant grow, nor an animal, nor anything else come into being. Again, Diogenes' text enacts what it describes, le menace du rien, as André Lacks puts it. What saves us from this hypothetical menace is air. Air is the universal principle of sameness, to auto, that enables things to relate to one another as discrete identities. It does this through its own capacity for self-differentiation, its ability, quote, being the same thing to change in many ways and become differentiated, heteroiuto. Through its doubleness, always the same and always differing, air forges the connection between a singular, unchanging being and the myriad individual beings that makes this cosmos a cosmos, not just a physical world, but a metaphysical world order. This connection is difficult to sustain, though, as the fragment illustrates. Simplicius admits to being concerned. When I first read the opening of his book, he says, I thought Diogenes was claiming the common substrate had to be something different from the four elements. Why then does he make it air? The answer, he suggests, is that, quote, there is much intelligence, noesis pole, in the arche, end quote. Air can perform its marvelous mediation because it has noesis. Now, noesis is not thought, but rather the activity of thinking. It's an activity that pertains to air, but is somehow separate from it. Diogenes does not say that air is thought, making nous, mind, his primary mover, as his near contemporary Anaxagoras had. Nor does he say that air thinks, noe, nor, in fact, despite my title, that it is intelligent, noetikos. Instead, he will say that air possesses noesis or has noesis in it. Noesis is something in air more than air, a kind of metaphysical supplement. This noesis allows air to be part of the physical makeup of the universe and simultaneously its abstract organizing principle. Simplicius quotes B3, which is passage 4 on the handout. For, he says, without intelligence, it would not be possible for it to be so distributed as to possess measures of all things, winter and summer and night and day and rains and winds and fair weather. And the other things, if one wishes to think about them, one would discover that they are thus arranged in the finest way possible. So air is the air around us, the atmosphere we breathe and the wind on our skin. But it is also a teleological principle immanent in the physical world, distributed through the phenomena in a measured, orderly way, metra, such that they are organized in the best or most beautiful manner, kalista. Metra bespeak a coherent and cohesive order made explicit in kalista and replicated in the measured dyads of the seasons and days, as well as in our own intellectual activity. Note the repetition of noesis in en noesthai, to which we will return. As in B2, so here, air appears on both sides of the antinomy, both the principle of order and one of the elements so ordered, and it mediates between the two. But whereas B2 imagines the dystopian consequences if air's mediation were to fail, B3 presents a utopian vision of its success thanks to the addition of noesis. With noesis, air can permeate and create the best of all possible worlds. That teleological necessity has its own teleological necessity. The counterfactual logic of this fragment predicates the perfection of the world on air's intelligence, but the causality goes in both directions. Cosmologically, the world is perfect thanks to air's intelligence, but logically, air must be intelligent because the world is manifestly perfect. Like the universal element in B2, intelligent air is posited logically, not empirically. It's offered as the object of contemplation, if one wishes to think about it, and intellectual discovery, heuriskoi. Air's noesis is thus both necessary and somehow extrinsic. One can imagine air without it, anou noesios. The conceptual separability of aer and noesis might lead us to wonder why Diogenes needs air at all. Why didn't he just make noesis the arche and have done with it? He had a model for this in Anaxagoras' Nous, a model he refers to explicitly at the opening of B5, which is passage 5 on the handout. Like Anaxagoras' sovereign mind, intelligent air is said to steer, kubernosthai, and rule, kratein, over all things. Socrates was famously underwhelmed by Anaxagoras' Nous. He complains that the philosopher never shows how, quote, ordering mind orders all things and establishes each in the best possible way, end quote. Diogenes would seem to make good Anaxagoras' failure with his stress on the orderly distribution and enlightened governance of intelligent air. Indeed, not only a ruler and helmsman, air that possesses noesis is a god, as he proclaims in B5, for this itself seems to me to be a theos. The opening of B5 is a veritable hymn to this brilliant deity, with its liturgical tricolon and polyptoton of Pan, to arrive at everything, to arrange all things, and to be in everything. With his emphatic and authoritative moi doke, it seems to me, Diogenes affirms his own faith in this mighty god and establishes himself as its high priest. If intelligence pulls air toward the divine, however, air keeps noesis firmly within the mundane world. The language in B5 evokes the autocracy of Anaxagoras' Nous, But whereas nous is emphatically separate and ontologically distinct from the things it governs, Diogenes' noetic air is immanent to the phenomena. It arrives at everything and is in everything. Quote, there's not even one thing that doesn't have a share of it, another echo of Anaxagoras that underlines the contrast. Despite its divinity, air shares essential characteristics of the phenomena. It is subject to physical processes of heating and cooling. It can be moist or dry, static or in motion. It has physical qualities of flavor and color, as well as spatial extension. So Diogenes not only insists on air as the arche, not noesis in its glorious noetic isolation, but also insists on its material properties. Intelligent air is at once a divine principle of order in the cosmos and a mundane physical element of that cosmos. It is simultaneously immortal and a body. To that extent, the supplement of noesis merely reduplicates and heightens the paradoxical qualities of air itself as both material and metaphysical, doubling down on the doubleness that makes it such an ideal and such an evasive medium. This material-immaterial hybrid allows Diogenes to maintain the metaphysics of the physical, as it were, the coherence, permanence, and immanent order that makes everything arranged in the finest way possible. We saw in B2 that phenomena are virtually defined by differentiation from the same. In B5, Diogenes examines that differentiation in the abstract, heteroiosis, a word he seems to have coined, and also examines its real-world consequences. Everything is different from every other thing, but not so different that they can't be compared. Everything is similar to every other, but not so similar that they become one. As in B2, intelligent air enables this delicate balance of sameness and difference by itself being both same and different. Eternally the same, to auto, air permeates everything. It not only unites all the diverse, living, percipient, and intelligent beings of the cosmos in the final line of the fragment, but also unites those animate beings with the cosmos itself. As breath, air is the psyche, the vital force, which is the same in all living things, but also fundamentally the same as the atmosphere outside us. The only difference between that animating air and atmospheric air is a relative difference of temperature. We begin to see why Diogenes is at pains to preserve air's materiality. Intelligent air is a divine body, eternal and undying, but it is still a body, material, and therefore susceptible to alteration. The paradox of B7, passage 3, is thus not incidental, but essential. It is because it can change that air can unify a cosmos of heterogeneous phenomena. It is divine because it is matter. Diogenes' term for this material mutability is pollutropos. We're back in B5 again now. Quote, for it, air is pollutropos, hotter and colder and drier and wetter and more stationary and having sharper movement, and there are many other differentiations in it, boundless both in flavor and color. The adjective pollutropos makes air an Odysseus, the hero known for his intelligence, and whose identity is defined in part by his ability to take on multiple identities. Odysseus is famously not named in the opening lines of the Odyssey. He's identified only as an aner pollutropos, a man of many ways. Instead of stabilizing Odysseus's character and the fluid epic tradition surrounding it through the rigid designator of a proper name, pollutropos stresses his mutability and polymorphism, as John Peridotto has argued. Diogenes' air, too, lacks a proper name. It is called air by mortals in the first line of B5, but it isn't reducible to that name. Like Odysseus, air's variability is its identity. Also like Odysseus, its identity is both active and passive. Pollutropos can mean much turning or much turned, and the Odyssey plays on the two meanings. As matter, Diogenes' air undergoes physical processes of warming, cooling, etc., buffeted by the force of heteroiosis. Quote, there are many differentiations within it, boundless in flavor and color. As for Anaximenes, air for Diogenes would seem to be without qualities of its own, a passive medium of change. But precisely as such, it functions as the principle of active differentiation. Air's polytropism becomes, at the end of the fragment, the defining feature of differentiation itself, since heteroiosis is polytropos, and the origin and cause of all the diverse and changeable phenomena that make up the cosmos. Both active and passive, air is a principle of sameness that differs from and in itself. It is the same precisely as differentiation. Here we seem to find that unstable arche, that groundless ground of metaphysics that Irigaray identified with air. This arche destabilizes metaphysics, as Irigaray predicts, not, however, by denying it any ground at all, but instead by grounding it in a volatile physics of difference. Built on mutable air, not only phenomenal beings are heterogeneous, being itself is heterogeneous, polytropos. For Irigaray, to remember air is to remember the material basis of both life and thought, and the intrinsic link between the two. Philosophers forget that we must breathe in order to think, she says. We live and think by means of the same air we share with the world and all the other beings around us. Remembering air thus also entails forgetting the exceptionalism we humans claim based on our capacity for thought. For Diogenes, to breathe simply is to live and to think, and air links each individual life materially to life as a whole. Air is the vital force, the suke, of all animate creatures, as B5 tells us. In equating air with suke, Diogenes again builds on Anaximenes. Aetius reports that Anaximenes said, quote, just as our suke, being air, controls us, so breath and air surround the entire cosmos. For he uses the words aer and pneuma as synonyms, end quote. For Anaximenes, air is the medium of a two-way analogy between microcosm and macrocosm. Our breath is air, and air is the breath of the cosmos. For Diogenes, that connection is not just an intellectual construct, an analogy, but a material continuity. The air inside me that gives me life is the same, to auto, as that inside every other living being. It is the same as the air that pervades the whole cosmos, all the way up to the sun. Air is thus the thread of common life binding all living beings. Quote, the suke of all living beings is the same. But being intelligent, air unites the cosmos not only in shared life, but also in shared thought. So we read in B4, passage 6 on the handout. Human beings share this in common with the other animals that breathe, ta alazoa anapneonta. They live by means of air. Air is thus their animating force, suke, but it is also their noesis. If breath stops, life and thought fail at the same moment. This equation of breath, life, and thought was controversial in antiquity. Aristotle canvasses different positions on the question at the opening of the De Anima. In fact, we could say that that whole treatise is an extended effort to unyoke these terms in order to recombine them in an integrated pyramid with material life, the nutritive soul, at the base, and abstract thought, nous, at the top. For Aristotle, the distinction between thinking and merely living undergirds a hierarchy of being. For while living belongs to all zoa by definition, thinking is a more exclusive activity. As he snidely observes, it doesn't even pertain to all human beings, much less all living beings. Diogenes' model allows for such difference and the hierarchy it entails. In B5, he explains that while all living beings share in intelligent air, both the air and the intelligence, they do so in different ways, for, quote, there are many ways both of air and of intelligence. That difference is a matter of degree, literally. The life-giving air called suke is air that is hotter than the external air in which we exist. And heat seems to be responsible in some way for transforming regular air into the purer, drier, noetic air. In B5, Diogenes anticipates Aristotle in observing that heat is not the same in all living beings, nor even in all human beings. As a result, quote, living beings are polytropa and many, and like one another in neither form, nor mode of life, nor intelligence. A neutral physical difference, temperature, becomes a difference in intelligence, which can hardly be neutral since it implies a differential relation to the divine ruling principle of the cosmos. This opens the door to a hierarchy of being that might, at its extreme, split living from thinking, granting the former to all animals who breathe, while restricting the latter to those whose breath is the right temperature, presumably men. But this differentiation is counterbalanced, I would say outweighed, by his emphasis on sameness. As the last sentence says, nevertheless, all things live and see and hear and possess the rest of their intelligence from the same. The vague hand-waving of the last clause, kaitein allen noesen, preserves the commonality of intelligence through a certain strategic vagueness as to what it entails. Aristotle is rolling in his grave. While the polysyndetic parallelism of kaitze, kaihorai, kaiakue refuses any attempt to sever thinking from living or to rank animals by different degrees, conceptual or thermostatic, of noesis. All creatures, inasmuch as they breathe, partake of both life and intelligence, as B4, passage 6, insists. As such, each one is a living, breathing proof, semeion, of the intelligence of air. To the extent that that air is a god, all creatures thus partake of the divine. Through the shared medium of intelligent air, Diogenes insistently links thought to life and each intelligent living being to each other and to a cosmos that is itself, to some extent, alive and intelligent. And yet that mediation is still unstable, and it risks failing in two directions. First, we might question whether Diogenes actually manages to unite air and noesis to the extent he pretends. In fact, although he brings the two into close proximity, he cannot seem to close the conceptual gap between them. We might note the weird prevarications in the first line of B5, which puts air quotes around air, what mortals call air, and in a sense around noesis too, what possesses intelligence. This periphrasis sustains a space between this divine noetic entity and the matter we call air. Maybe that can be chalked up to the limits of human language, and the gap would seem to be closed with the demonstrative adjective tutu by this, which can be either masculine or neuter, and therefore conflates the masculine aer with the neuter what possesses intelligence. But the space is reopened a few sentences later in the many ways of both air itself and of intelligence, and is sustained to the end of the fragment, where noesis figures as one of the individual differences united by the same of air. Air and intelligence don't quite come together. There's always a hair's breadth, or rather an air's breath, between them. It's not so much that air escapes thought, but that air and thought cannot be thought fully together, even as we're told that they must be, and that we must actively think their total integration. That nebulous gap, or metaxu, within his metaphysical arche marks the limits of Diogenes' thought, but also of noesis itself. Irigaray proposes that air as the material basis of thought ruptures thought's own self-reflexivity. It figures thought's inability to fully think itself, especially in its relation to life. Diogenes refuses to think about this, and the space in between aer and noesis is ignored, Irigaray would say forgotten, in the hymn to intelligent air that follows. And yet the hiatus within that divine entity holds open the possibility that living and thinking might come apart, leaving living creatures, potentially including us humans, alive but unintelligent, or worse still, intelligent but not alive. If aer without noesis is just so much wind, what or where is noesis without aer, the material medium of its dissemination and agency in the world? Thought without breath is a lifeless God. So air and noesis are at risk of separating. But second, there's the opposite danger that air and noesis might cohere so completely that thinking becomes just a kind of heavy breathing. This is essentially the objection Theophrastus raises in his discussion of Diogenes' theory of perception. He reports that Diogenes attributed thinking to pure dry air within the body and believed it was impeded by bodily moisture. This is why we think less clearly when we're drunk, and also why children and quadrupeds are less intelligent, because they're moister from being closer to the ground. For Theophrastus, the conflation of air and thought tethers intellect to the physical body in a way that fails to account for its unique properties or the unique properties of those beings that possess it. He spells out the various ludicrous entailments. If breathing purer air makes things more intelligent, birds should be the most intelligent animals since they live in the purest air. Again, if humans are more intelligent than other animals because they stand upright and breathe higher, purer air, that would suggest that taller people are more intelligent than short, a consequence that naturally concerns me, and that you could increase your IQ by moving to a higher altitude. We're reminded once more of Aristophanes' astute parody in The Clouds, where Socrates appears suspended in an aerial basket so that he can mix his thinking with the pure upper air. On the ground, his thought would be damp, he says, like watercress. Theophrastus's criticisms, to say nothing of Aristophanes, may strike us as silly, but there's a serious point here. If noesis is simply respiration, Diogenes' arche is just hot air. It loses the metaphysical qualities that enable it to mediate between beings and being so as to make of our cosmos a true cosmos, an intelligent and intelligible order, the best and most beautiful possible world. Diogenes entertains this dire possibility in a conditional mode. We saw in B2, passage 2, the counterfactual condition imagining le menace du rien that would result without air's balance between same and different. And we saw in B3, passage 4, the loss of cosmic measures that would result without noesis. But in that latter fragment, this catastrophic condition is answered by another. Quote, and the other things, if one wishes to think about them, one would discover that they are thus arranged in the finest way possible. The repetition of noesis in en noesthai is more than just a cute pun. It asserts the continuity between our own inner intelligence, en noesthai, and the intelligence of the air outside us, the continuity of life and thought, and the unity of being explicated in B4 and B5. But B3 makes that unity depend on us. If the fragment's opening formulation makes it possible to imagine air without intelligence, it is our own thinking that holds the two together, securing all the metaphysical benefits of that union. Air's mediation, as we've seen, requires continual remediation. Here, we are called upon to supply it in our own will to thought. We think and breathe thanks to intelligent air, and by thinking and breathing, we sustain intelligent air. With the circularity that characterizes Diogenes' teleological thought, the noesis within us perpetuates the external noesis that is its own origin. It is thus responsible for the very perfection that it enables us to discover. By thinking, we thus make the world perfect, if we are willing to, etis bulletae. But are we willing to? The optative heuriskoi leaves that question open, and therefore leaves the perfection of the cosmos a mere potentiality. In this conditional clause, we see thought literally thinking itself and reaching the limits of that self-reflexivity in the will of an anonymous, willful individual who may or may not be willing to conjure the world's telos in his mind. For Aristotle, thought eternally thinking itself is God, the unmoved mover, the supreme author of rational order in the cosmos. For Diogenes, that sublime self-consciousness is enacted in and depends on the choice of an anonymous someone who may, like Bartleby, simply prefer not to. This impasse demands one final mediation. What would make someone want to think about the world's perfection? The answer is obvious. Reading Diogenes' Logos, this hymn to the holy air and its sacred noesis. This solemn Logos is closely aligned with its subject matter from the start, as we saw in B1, where the indisputable arche of the cosmos is also the arche of the Logos, and the expression or explication is as primary and august as its subject. That explication offers us many great signs, megasemeia in B4, of air's intelligence and its effects. By the time the reader has finished reading the great semeia of On Nature, the intelligence of air will have become clearly manifest to her, hos dedelositae, future perfect, and tede sum graphe emphanos. It is already manifest to Diogenes himself. With his repeated moi doke and moi delon doke, he personally stands surety for his theory and offers his own ardent belief as one of the great proofs of his vision. He most definitely is someone who wants to ennoesthai, air's noesis. His goal as an author is to make the reader want the same. Ultimately, then, it is his intelligence that enacts air's intelligence and actualizes the beautiful cosmos it makes possible. Air binds life and thought, but it requires the support of his logos in order to do so. Logos is not an alienation of our physical being in the abstraction of the conceptual, as Irigaray maintains. Instead, it is precisely the medium that connects them, ensuring that life is intelligent, if you want to think about it, and in that very act, that intelligence is alive. This mediation is not forgotten by Diogenes, no more than air itself. It is remembered in his reminder to the reader. The world we live in is perfect, if only, and only if, you are willing to think it so. Thank you.
Questions? I have a question, though. I'm not quite sure how to formulate it. I love this whole concept, and I was just thinking, in addition to Aristophanes' clouds, about Aristophanes' birds, that there's so much there about, like the wind egg and birds being up in the air and flighty, but also kind of gaping, so that they're breathing a lot. I just don't know. Have you thought about Diogenes in relation to the birds?
That would be so interesting. Yeah, and that wind egg's usually attached to Orphic philosophy, I think. It would be really interesting to think of the birds as more intelligent beings, which they are, obviously, than the humans in that particular scenario because of the air. And somebody who's better at meter than I am could do a lot, I think, with the breathiness of the lyrics there, and think about, are they kind of hyperventilating? Are they producing more air even in the course of the verse? Yeah, that would be really, really interesting.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Do you personally think that air is intelligent? And if you do, why do you think it's important to consider air as intelligent?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a very hard question. I mean, I think one of the reasons I really love studying these early philosophers is that their theories are so crazy that you can't really even ask, is it right or wrong? Right? Like, I mean, what would it mean for air to be intelligent? Scientists are showing that there is a kind of, I mean, what is intelligence? Well, I mean, there's a logic to the way things work, right? To the way chemicals connect, to the way weather systems work, to the way living organisms like us work. So to that extent, you could say there is an intelligence in air. But I think all these questions come down to definition, and definitions. What do you say? What does intelligence mean, right? It's the same as when we say animal intelligence. It depends on how you define intelligence. But, as I said, like one of the fun things with these guys is you can look at the way the logic works without having to get invested in the ideas themselves, right? In the contents of the idea.
When I first saw the title of this talk, Intelligent Air, IA, AI.
Oh,
So
I hope you're not disappointed.
no. That is my background, but that's not what brought me here to a Sather lecture. So maybe my question is sort of kind of working around that notion of not mentioning the current enthusiasm as just a phase which might be passing as it has passed over the last 30 years again. But with respect to what mention is there of mechanism, particularly around something that might pass as intelligent, as maybe not co-equal with the implicit humans here, but just as a mechanism more than the simplest mechanism that might be mentioned. I can't think of anything here.
Well, the mechanisms, it's a good question. The go-to mechanisms for the early Greek natural philosophers are the body and the cosmos. And both of them, like what else is there, right? So both of them are permeated by intelligent air and work with the regularity they do because air is intelligent, because it has a design. Sort of artifactual. I don't know if Diogenes talks about, there's so few fragments of his. The fragments I'm thinking of, he has cosmological, at least paraphrases, and a long paraphrase about the way blood moves through the veins in the body. But I can't remember if some of the others do, like Empedocles has a long fragment about the clepsydra, which is a little contraption for moving water, and about the lamps and as analogy to the eye. So, but and scholars debate about whether those are just analogies to natural mechanisms like the cosmos or like the eyeball, or whether there's some kind of continuity there. So yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk, Victoria. My question kind of comes from 2 points. One of which is that as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think of another element of difference and differentiation in my mind, which is the Heraclitean River. And I was also thinking about how you were saying that there's sort of like this rhetoric around like, body is closer to the ground and damper, not having as much access to noesis. So I was wondering if there's sort of anything to be said about water and noesis, or the absence of noesis in water as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. That's a good question. I mean, one doesn't associate water so much with mind in ancient thought. I mean, that's really interesting, the way the elements get divided up there. And you remember the Heraclitus fragment you're talking about, the ancient sources associate it with Suke, but really only as a life, not as intelligence. And the spark of intelligence, so people like Gabor Beteg argue, is associated with fire. So you've got, life associated with water, fire associated with thought. And the way these thought, life, and breath come sort of interweave amongst one another, and the way the elements mediate that is such a fascinating process. But definitely people draw connections between the sort of purer, the lighter, purer, kind of airier, drier quality of noetic air for Diogenes and Heraclitus, and the idea that fire is the most sort of divine, right?
With your knowledge of these classical figures, what do you think their thoughts would be on air pollution?
That's a great question. I mean, pure air is more intelligent. And he says it, he says it over and over again. And that's true not only in us, but of the air we breathe. And so if the air we breathe is impure, we'll be dumber. Cause and effect. Yeah, good question.
Looking at comparing the end of the fourth fragment with the end of the sixth, I was wondering how can a perfect world accommodate death? Intelligence failing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just all a cycle, right? They are very Heraclitean too. Things have to die to be reborn for these guys. I mean, generation and corruption is just the name of the game for all of us, for us and all phenomena. There's no permanence in the material world, and that's sort of the defining feature. And that's Callista for them, right? Which is kind of interesting difference from the way we think of it. Thanks, John.
Hey, thank you, Victoria. So I feel like passage 4 is driving me insane. So maybe you can help address that. So this seems to get awfully specific, right? First about Metra. What is it about having Metra in particular? And then the list of everything.
Yes.
Also
it's
seems very
weird.
specific.
Yeah.
Do you have more thoughts?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Metra, I mean, it goes back to Lauren's point. That's a Heraclitean term, right? And it's sort of a term for regular alternation. But if you look at the list, it is very regular. I sort of glossed over this for time reasons, but it is very regular, except that there's a weird intrusion in the third dyad. So we've got winter and summer. We've got night and day. So far, so good. Then we've got rain and wind and sunny days. And if you think about these as the sort of fundamental early Greek natural scientific opposites, hot and cold, right? Summer and winter, dark and light, night and day, and then wet and dry. The intruder there is anemone, winds. And so it's precisely air as phenomenon that breaks that nice dyadic structure and creates a sort of weird triad there. So, yeah, I mean, it's measures, but it's also an intrusion into the measure that you need precisely. And that intrusion, I would say, is air as material being, right, as a material phenomenon that both disrupts and enables the measures that are the metaphysical order of his cosmos. So thank you for that question.
I think this will be the last question.
Thomas.
Sorry.
I also am really sorry. I'm also obsessed with that number 4, B3. And yeah, I wanted to ask you about, I mean, it strikes me, I mean, I loved your point about, I mean, these kind of chiastic mirrorings between, you know, his own writing and what he's writing about and how this replicates itself in his prose. And I mean, it strikes me that like an asymmetrical moment is precisely that aetis bulletae clause, right? That like,
Yeah.
it puts air quote, you know, it's like a parenthetical and it like enacts that hiatus that you are saying, you know, his own theory
Yes.
seems to install between thought and air. And there's so many amazing like mirroring like aneo noesios and noesta. But
Mhm, mhm.
so I kind of have a two-part question. One is, you know, what if you have other thoughts on his kind of prose technique and like this kind of distribution, you know, his meeting out of these chiasms and mirror points throughout. But I also, sorry if this is too much, I wanted to ask about, yeah, that aetis bulletae. I
Yeah.
mean, do you see a difference? Like, is that, how do you different, I mean, do you see a difference between logos and this bulletae or like this, like
Yeah.
is it a kind of will or drive underpinning logos? Is logos that will itself? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to, you know, bring
I-
psychoanalysis into it, how
I
this
totally share your perplexity with that, Tomasa. I mean, that's that I think is precisely the crux of the issue, that it's this other, what is it? What is boule? What is will? Is it a cognitive state? Is it an emotional state? It's another state that is next to logos, on which, next to noesis, on which noesis seems to depend, and therefore on which the beauty and perfection of the cosmos depends. But it's untheorized here. It's not clear what it is or, you know, how it's controlled. To me, this parenthetical, you know, there's so little Diogenes that it's hard to talk about regularities, but to me, this works in similar ways to the moi doces, those little parentheticals, that there's the intrusion of a kind of a thought that, I mean, doke too, right, is not noesis and it's not legain. It's not any of these key philosophical thoughts or terms. So it's another kind of apperception or cognition or being in the world, who knows, that again is really essential to holding the whole thing together, but at sort of orthogonal to it in a way. And so I read those two quite closely in tandem, but I think, you know, this idea of will and the idea, obviously, I think so much of this is negative, right? I mean, it wouldn't be, without noesis, it wouldn't be this perfect world, right? So we're imagining this perfect world that has to then be, that negation has to be negated. It has to be reversed through an act of will that is, as you say, quite unmotivated and sort of stuck in there in this very symptomatic way. As for his style, I mean, again, there's so little of it that it's hard to say what his style is. I mean, and it's, you know, it's hard to generalize from these fragments. There is a certain, I would say, ambivalence in the style, like in B5, which is, and B2, the sameness, difference, it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And you think, I mean, you get the feeling that if the fragments were longer, he wouldn't resolve it. He would just keep going. It's the same, but it's different. It's the same, but it's different. It's the same, right? Because he wants it to be both the same and different. And he wants both these things. He wants every phenomenon to have its own discrete identity, to have the world around us and to be able to say that's a chair and this is a podium, that's a microphone. But he also wants all these things to be united in some way. And he hasn't quite figured out how to, square that difference. And so the kind of seesaw quality of his prose might have something to do with that. Yeah, and this is obviously a kind of a oblique addendum to the lectures I gave almost 18 months ago here. That there wasn't quite enough of him to make a whole chapter for the book of, and the style, what they say about if you can't say something nice, right? The style is so clunky and difficult. But I think the thought is quite clunky and difficult too, and in very interesting and generative ways.
Good, thank you. We are out of time for questions. I'm sorry to say. It was nice to have some questions after so many lectures, right? We do have a reception for those of you who are here in person. Those of you who are on Zoom, too bad. Join us again for our next talk on Saturday, March 15th. And with that, we will conclude. Thank Victoria again.